Thanks, Professor Tewari. So I will be short because Professor Tewari and Professor Ahluwalia they have covered like a lot of points that we all will be sharing with you. So my topic is mainly focused on Surat's water system and how through its risk it has learned and adapted to make itself more resilient. So basically, climate proofing its water system. So first, let's understand what this concept of climate proofing is. Basically, there are a lot of definitions of climate proofing. So it's basically acting and making decisions to make your infrastructure resilient to anticipated scenarios or risks. Not only anticipated risks, but also developing capacity to act on certain uncertainties that we don't know about or don't fully understand. And then realizing that certain areas are prone to risk and people have to live with the risk, but how do we live with it while using local knowledge, learn reiteratively, experiment in your learnings, and also build partnership at the local level when you are actually dealing with the risk. So we will, when we talk about Surat in the subsequent slides, we will see some of these things come up in the things they did, in the things the municipalities did. So before I jump into the learnings and adaptation measures, so let's just a basic background. It's one of the fastest growing million-plus cities in India and actually in the world. Talking more about its water supply system, it's fully dependent on River Tapi, but the amount of water it gets, that is dependent on a upstream dam called Ukai, where the catchment area mostly more than 90% of the catchment area for the dam is in different they are in different states. So they don't have too much control of how much water they get in the city and flowing through the river. And since the dam has been built, a lot of development has happened, and every monsoon there has been they have experienced flood, and which has caused lots of devastation. But among all this floods that have happened, the city experienced two major ones, one in 1994 and 2006, and we will see how they have used these two events to learn and make themselves more resilient. So they have done this in the past, but moving forward, as Amrita's work has shown, the region will have more rainfall. The intensity of rainfall will be more. The maximum temperature will rise, and as well as they will experience seawater level. So even though they have learned and did something based on their past risk, they have to keep doing it in the future because that's what the climate is going to move towards. So let's talk about the first turning point, the first major turning point. That was the 1994 floods. As Professor Tewari mentioned, there was a big health scare after that, and the inadequacy of poor public service was highlighted, and that kind of brought people to action. So the immediate action was taken by the municipality, and as Professor Tewari mentioned, so they realized that stormwater drainage, solid waste management, drain cleanings, and so those were more important than anything else to take care of the bad consequences they just faced through the plague. Once they took care of that, they did really some innovative kind of like structural changes, like decentralizing the governance. So they have delineated authorizing powers. So the municipal commissioners delineated, so they had commissioners that delineated their powers. Officers were given designated areas. They were asked to spend more time on the ground. The complaint system was updated. So they did some structural change in how they were going to govern moving forward. So that was something at the governance level. What about the water supply system? So as I mentioned, they don't have too much control of how much water they get. but they have been trying to augment their water supply system over the years, but they didn't and after the flood, the shortage was quite acute. But fortunately, with the help of local industry association, they got the funding and they built a weir within the city limits. So what that did was, that was really a boon for the city's supply. They could trap the water within the city limits. They could pump the raw water, treat it, and supply it. So within 10 years, their water supply capacity increased more than threefolds. So after they built the weir. So you see, when we talked about climate proofing, partnership at the local level was important. Here we see partnering with the local industry association, getting the funds, and that helped to really augment their water supply system. The other things they did was modernizing their departments, computerizing the water supply and bill collection. But the learning did not end at that event or right after the event. So they kept learning throughout the process. So they realized that to augment their urban services, they need funds. And funds, just collecting funds at the local level is not sufficient. So they went to the national level, they went to the state level. So what are the schemes were available? They applied for it, they utilized it to increase their treatment capacity, storage capacity. But they also they were experimenting in it, as one of the definitions of climate proofing mentioned. So they set up a pilot biogas electrification plant. They were also focused on efficiency, not only revenue generating solutions, but efficiency. Energy efficiency cell was created, and they were selling partially treated wastewater to industry. So they were generating additional revenues. So another one thing that really stood out was the redundancy build. They actually took step to build redundancy in their water supply system. So what that did was, even if in a case of risk or hazard, so if some water treatment is damaged, so it doesn't affect the whole system. So a water distribution plant can get water from any other alternate treatment center. So that redundancy was built in it. So that was happening. And what this did was, the bouncing back from a risk, that makes this kind of redundancy built in the system, makes it easier to bounce back faster. That we'll see, as the map that as you see, it's there is a normal scenario, and there is a another scenario that when there is something abnormal happens and you have to shut down certain intake tanks, or so how does the city will distribute water. So this system came in handy for after 2006 flood. The 2006 flood was a second turning point, and that the magnitude of the flood was much larger than the 1994. But fortunately, there was no health hazard or health catastrophe that happened right after. But most of the city was underwater, so there was heavy economic loss and lives were lost. So the city realized that just being resilient, building redundancy is not enough. They have to build resilience that is much deeper in its nature. So they adopted some best practices, like for electrical and mechanical maintenance. For water quality, as Professor Tewari mentioned, that was very critical. So after flood, the water quality really deteriorates, and with the rising temperature in the water, also there was case of worms in the water. So water quality was critical. They realized that, so they adopted some international standard to monitor water quality in real time, and they have updating this standard throughout, and also making sure that they realize that when it comes to water supply to a city, kind of getting back power is the first thing you do. Otherwise, you can't pump and distribute. So how did they go about? So in each of the water pumping stations, so every equipment, every key critical equipment were built on a platform above the high flood line. And they had dual power supply system, so they could move to diesel gen sets and all. So those are the things they did. And so those were some kind of like important things, but they also realized there are some structural issues in every water network in Indian cities that needs to be addressed, be it leakage, non-revenue water. So they did leakage mapping, water audit, change the tariff system so that they could make people accountable for the amount of water they're using. And they used, they were documenting all the risks, and they used this documentation to kind of teach the staff who were coming on board. So they also used this as a learning process. So kind of like, in conclusion, so as you say, as we saw, they were learning as they were facing risks, and they also leveraged the network they were part of, like especially the Rockefeller ASEAN network. So one of the 10 cities in Asia that got funding. Using that fund, they have set up a climate change trust, and under which they have kind of like established some very innovative kind of programs. Early warning system is one, URSMS, where they are monitoring water supply and health trends in real time. So they're like really leveraging this network they're part of. So in conclusion, so they have been learning, they have been experimenting over the last 20 years, and they have success, and they have maintained the success. That's the like really like good or important part. And the thing, what is important to understand is, in India, where every step or every action you take is reactionary, because you face the risk and then you react to the risk. But every step you take can be forward-looking. And that's what exactly Surat did. They decentralized the government system. Their solutions were revenue generating. They focused on efficiency. They adopted the latest technology. And finally, they used the local and the national and international network they have created and leveraged it to kind of make their water system climate proof. So yeah, so that's my share. And I will ask Professor Dr. Saon Ray, Senior Fellow, to kind of present her paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Indro. I'm going to very quickly talk about what the farms did, and Meenu has already introduced some of this, so it can be, in fact, quicker. Climate change can induce various risks for farms and it's on its supply chains. But the predominant focus of adaptation has been the government and communities, and not so much firms. And the World Economic Forum is, in fact, listed that the failure of the adaptation measures by businesses as one of the major global risks with highest impact. Adaptation in the context of industries has been examined in the IPCC Chapter 11 of the second assessment report, which notes that certain components of industry, energy, and transport sectors display higher sensitivity. But there is a gap in the literature on climate proofing of industrial networks. And this presentation is, in fact, going to talk about the role of adaptation measures of firms in the case of slow versus sudden onset climate events. Quickly, the overview of the presentation, I'll talk about the literature briefly, and then talk about Surat's climate profile, and then the industrial profile, and how the adaptation in both these cases, the slow versus the sudden onset, has been done in the case of Surat, and then finally conclude with key messages and policy implications. Now, the effect of climate change varies across business structures, and of course, so adaptation will also take many forms. Adaptation is very complex, and a firm's response will be determined by whether the impact is in the short run or the long run. And many firms may not actually classify their actions as adaptation and actually use what risk management to describe some of these measures of adaptation. Now, what is required for climate change adaptation by firms is, first, understanding the nature of the climate risk, second, assessing the vulnerability that they face, And third, understanding the nature of the regulatory barriers that may arise in overcoming the vulnerability. Now, this has been often talked about, that development is the best form of adaptation, and in fact, the IPCC's special report on managing risks of extreme events has talked about that, this fact. The Stern report has also talked about the fact that adaptation is the only response that is available for the impacts. But then, what is happening on the ground? The IPCC's fifth assessment report, in fact, underlines the fact that the adaptation literature ascribes different meanings to the terms, and hence there is some clarity needed on the opportunities, the constraints, and the limits. And this is what is increasing the ambiguity related to understanding this issue or addressing it. It also points out that in moving from the general definition, it is important to understand who is adapting, to what are they adapting, and what is the process of adapting. Now, the developing countries, as we all know, are more vulnerable to climate change. This has been documented enough. But there is also the fourth assessment report concludes that there are substantial limits and barriers to adaptation, particularly in developing countries. And this is not only related to the points that I've talked about earlier, but also the governance structure, the quality of the national institutions, and the ongoing development challenges. So all of this has to come together when firms or governments are doing the adaptation. And Ajur et al., in fact, have talked about the fact that adaptation is complicated by whether since the conditions are also changing, and whether there are long or short-term impacts of that action, how will that affect the whole process of adaptation? Now, certain activities have been, the literature talks about the fact that they are more prone to climate risk. Things like transportation, construction, offshore oil and gas production, manufacturing, which is dependent on water, tourism, and industries which are located in coastal regions or permafrost regions. But the survey of the literature on these issues has shown that a very small percentage of firms actually conduct strategic adaptation. And in fact, a survey of the literature has shown that there are only 2 papers that had addressed this issue in great depth, but both were on energy production and not necessarily to the other parts of the supply chain. Linala actually has offered a framework for organizational adaptation and resilience to extreme weather climate events for firms. And it states that while firms have the organizational capacities for addressing challenges arising out of competitive conditions, they are not equipped to handle situations arising out of extreme weather events. And Ahluwalia, in fact, has classified the adaptation responses into 3 categories: no adaptation, soft or no regret, and the hard implementation of adaptation measures. And a survey of the CDP data has revealed that most MNCs that they had surveyed are actually doing the cautious or with little or no climate measures in place. So for first category, actually. The sectors in the agro-industry that depend on products such as grain, sugar, rubber, etc., are very vulnerable to climate change, precipitation patterns particularly, and intensity of extreme weather events. But there are also other things that are happening. For example, sea level rise could happen in some cities. Surat is not an example of that, but Kochi that we surveyed was one example of that. And the other kind of effect that has been talked about in the literature is the effect of heat. But most of the work has been done in the context of residential or consumers, and not so much in the case of farms. And the higher temperatures would actually reduce the need for heating in some countries, but it will increase that of air conditioning. And so worker productivity that Professor Tewari talked about, all of that will come in. GIZ has presented 2 cases of adaptation by micro and MSMEs, basically in the textile and the metalworking industries in India. And it makes a distinction between the impact of climate change on the location and buildings, operating processes, logistics, and stocks, and observes that while buildings or the logistics and stocks were not particularly affected by the climate change, the operating processes did show decreased productivity in the summer months in both industries. The other problem is that majority of the small and medium firms do not have the capacity and resources to predict the impact of climate change on their operations and quickly make the adjustments which are necessary to overcome these challenges. So as I discussed, that there are three critical components that play a role in dealing with the adaptation. First, understanding the risk. Second, assessing the vulnerability that the firm faces. And third, understanding the nature of the regulatory barriers that arise. Now, once a firm has an understanding of all of these aspects, it can actually, in the case of a gradual onset climate risk, devise a policy to overcome the vulnerability. But the picture is much more complicated because there are interdependencies between these components. And while many studies have actually looked at the issue of risk, the second and the third part, that is assessing the vulnerability and understanding the nature of the regulatory barriers, has not been given much attention in the literature. And these are very important because the sourcing of raw material, the inward-outward supply chain, as well as the choice of the location of the industry needs to be understood to make these processes work. Now, the problem is that while most of this has been talked about in the case of slow onset, what happens in a sudden onset will be very different. And depending on the losses that the firm faces in one instance, it can actually take those adaptive measures to combat the risk in future. And in the case of Surat, we'll see that this did happen, the two instances of the flooding that has been talked about. Alternatively, the measures by firms need to take into account how to overcome the vulnerability in the case of slow onset, or the post-disaster reduction in the case of a sudden onset. So this is the kind of a simplistic framework to understand how this works. Now, the way to look at this graph is to start at the end, extreme right-hand side. So if you have, you are actually looking at devising a policy to overcome the vulnerability, you would first need to know whether the disaster or the event is a slow onset or a sudden onset. And then, of course, you would have to do all the other things on the left, which is understanding the risk, the assessment of the vulnerability, and understanding the regulatory barrier. But what this clearly shows out that the reaction has to be different in the slow and the sudden onset case. It cannot be the same, and the policies have to be obviously different in these two instances. Now, the Surat's example, the temperature, according to some of the climate models, it's expected to increase by about 4 degrees, which is a lot. Precipitation is also expected to increase, so there'll be more days of extreme rainfall. There's been some cases of tidal inundation, and as well as the river flooding, which Indro also talked about. As far as the industrial profile is concerned, Surat is a very major industrial hub of the country, because apart from the textile manufacturing, diamond cutting, polishing industries, and the intricate zari works, in Hazira you have, which is just about 11 kilometers from Surat, you have the chemical industries, the gas-based industries, and also companies like ONGC, Reliance, SR, and Shell have their operations. Much of the industrial development in Surat is actually located within the city limits, and in that sense, Surat is a truly industrial city. It's a dominant player in the textile sector in the country. It's one of the largest centers in the world for production of synthetic fabrics, and mainly nylon and polyester. And as far as diamond is concerned, it is actually the diamond hub of the country. Now, how did Surat actually adjust to some of the firms in Surat? How did they adjust to some of the slow versus sudden onset cases? Now, the slow onset case in Surat was basically the rise in temperature as well as deterioration in the air quality. I'll talk about only the temperature rise, and the sudden onset was the 2 floods that happened. We were actually, when we did the field work, the flood of 2013 had just happened, and so there was this response in comparison with the 2006 flood. As far as the temperature rise is concerned, Sudarshan and Tewari has documented the responses of the weaving and the diamond industry to changes in temperature. In case of the diamond industry and the weaving, the response was to install more air conditioning. In the case of the weaving industry, more frequent breaks were allowed. In the case of flooding, the diamond industry moved their raw materials, or the diamonds, basically the uncut diamond, unpolished diamonds, to safer locations. But in the case of the weaving industry, this was not possible. Most of the inputs are very bulky. The output also, the gray cloth was also very bulky, and usually they are on the ground floor. A lot of that was destroyed in the 2013 flood. But then they did some interesting things. So this basically table actually shows what they did. In the case of the weaving industry, the air conditioning and more frequent breaks were allowed for temperature rise. And in the diamond industry case, the air conditioning was for the part of the value chain that was the most critical, which is the part that Dr. Tewari also talked about. In the case of the sudden onset, the two floods that happened, in the 2013 flood, what happened is that the flyovers, in fact, were used by the firms to park goods with finished goods, because a lot of the, the output had been destroyed in the 2006 floods. So they had learned a lesson from that. And as far as the diamond industry is concerned, the raw diamonds were moved to a safer location in case of flooding. So this clearly brings out that the adaptation responses of the two industries, in the case of the slow and the sudden onset, have to be different. They were different, and some of them did bring the required results. So the adaptation responses can be characterized in various ways. The adaptive capacity has been defined as the potential or the capability of a system to adapt to, and it depends on the changes in processes, practices, or structures that may be needed to combat the effects of climate change in case of manufacturing firms. The policy responses of firms have to be viewed in the context of the slow versus the sudden onset events, and they have to be designed to overcome the vulnerability in case of slow onset. In case of sudden onset events, post-disaster responses can be designed such that if the event were to occur again, the responses could be faster or better. For example, in the 2013, we saw that some of the things that they had done in the after the 2006 flood did lead to better responses, quicker responses. Now, of course, this is all that firms do, but then there is also the other part of the story, which is, I haven't talked about at all, but which Professor Tewari has talked about, basically what the governments need to do, because some of these actions by the private players can also bring in maladaptation, and that is something that governments, in fact, have to look at. Thank you. I'll now call upon Amrita to make her presentation.
Suggestion, since we had planned a break at 11:35, that we'll take a break now, and then Amrita will speak about health, and then we'll speak about waterways in Kochi as a climate response, and then solid waste management when we return, and then we'll move on to the panel after that. So if we can keep the break to maybe 5 minutes, you can bring your tea here. That would be great. Thank you so much.